like to welcome all of you to the March webinar on OSHA's Control of Hazardous Energy Standards Requirement. This webinar will go through the obligations employers have to comply with OSHA's lockout standard. I'll talk about why I don't like tagout here in a bit, but the lockout standard. The agenda, we'll talk about the energy control program requirements, the employee training requirements, machine-specific energy control procedures, the lockout process itself. OSHA has a specific process they want followed, special circumstances that need to be addressed, or you may potentially need to address those, and the annual review requirements, or the periodic review or periodic inspection requirements, as OSHA likes to call it. That, to me, is the part that's most often missed in most lockout programs. I want to briefly talk about tagout. I do not like the word tagout. I think it diminishes the importance of this standard. It diminishes the importance of what employees should do to protect themselves. OSHA does permit tagout in very limited circumstances. It actually is slightly more burdensome because OSHA says you need to take additional controls if you're going to use tagout. However, the intent of tagout when the standard was written, and realize the standard was initially developed in 1977, it was initially proposed in 1977 and didn't become law until late in 1989. So it took 12 years of development, and then it was rolled out in 1989 and has not changed, or minor tweaks, since that point in time. The intent of the standard was that everything should be locked out, except they realized there was some old equipment that you may not be able to lock out every device. You wouldn't be able to lock out everything that needed to be locked out. And they didn't think, OSHA thought it was too burdensome to make employers go through and buy new equipment, retrofit equipment. So they said, look, if it can't be locked out, you can utilize tagout as long as you follow the tagout process. But any equipment that's renovated, retrofitted, undergoes major change, it should be equipped with locking energy control sources, and then that device should then be locked out in the future. It shouldn't be that tagout is this ongoing exemption. And I don't see that used much. Typically, if lockout's not being done, tagout's not being done either. So I don't like the word tagout, though, because like I said, I think it diminishes the importance of the standard and what it's supposed to do. I do want to point out the application of lockout tagout, or the purpose of lockout tagout. It applies anytime an employee is servicing or maintaining equipment in which the unexpected energization or startup of the machine or equipment or the release of stored energy could harm employees. And it's a lot of times this applies. That unexpected energization is interesting. In 2016, 3 years ago, OSHA tried to eliminate that word. Just tried to scrape it out of the standard completely. They put a proposal out to get rid of that. OSHA's thought was, as too many employers are relying upon the unexpected clause of the standard to say, oh, this doesn't apply to us, because the employee was fully aware it was going to harm them if it started back up. And that is not the intent of that word at all. The intent of that word, and OSHA doesn't lose on citations often, is that if you have this piece of process equipment, and my favorite example is a baggage conveyor at an airport. They're supposed to have a buzzer and a light that sounds for 30 seconds before that baggage conveyor starts up. And one employer has actually won in this situation. It says, look, we have an alarm. The alarm goes off for a set period of time. Employees know after 30 seconds of that alarm, then that piece of equipment's going to move. Therefore, it's not unexpected. And they have won in one situation. That employer won contesting an OSHA citation in one situation. Very rare that happens. Again, OSHA tried to strike the word unexpected. I've given this more attention than I should have, because the focus here is to make sure that you're just preventing injury to employees by properly locking out equipment. There are some exceptions to lockout requirements, specifically normal production operations, which I'll talk about a little bit more, equipment that is cord and plug connected, which I'll talk about a little bit more, and hot tap operations. However, you have to have other procedures in place if you're doing hot tap operations. I do need to mention, though, that there are limitations to normal production operations, equipment that is cord and plug connected, and hot tap operations. Normal production operations, easy to say, hard to define when it comes to OSHA, is normal production operations are things that are recurring throughout the process. They need to be done as part of the production process. And I'll give an example here in a little bit. It's important to realize, though, that If you have an employee placing their hands into a machine, bypassing a guard, or putting their hand into a point of operation or a danger area in that machine, that is not a normal production operation. So you could say, oh, we have to make this adjustment, and the employee puts their hand in it and gets fingers lopped off. OSHA saying, no, sorry, that's not a normal production operation. That requires lockout, tagout. So that's the first test of normal production operations, is that they're not putting their hand in the machine, they're not bypassing guards, they're not getting their hand into a point of operation. OSHA says that minor tool changes and adjustments and other minor servicing activities which take place during normal production operations are not covered, or they're exempt, if they're repetitive, integral, and routine to the use of the equipment for production, provided that there's alternative measures that provide effective protection. I'd love to give you real straightforward examples of what that is and what that isn't. The best two examples straight from OSHA, and even OSHA says they may not always apply, are changing grinding wheels on a grinder. You have a bench grinder, you change that grinding wheel, that's not a normal production operation. That grinding wheel is going to wear down, it's going to wear out, so you have to take off a guard, you have to remove the spindle nut, you have to put the grinding wheel on, test the grinding wheel, put the grinding wheel on. OSHA says no, lockout, tagout would apply, assuming it's not cord and plug connected, assuming there's more than one energy source, which depending on the type of grinder, it may or may not have more than one energy source. That wouldn't be a normal production operation. However, OSHA says changing a drill bit on a drill press is generally considered a normal production operation. Not all the time, but most of the time. But OSHA says, look, depending on the type of drill press, you need to take some corrective control measures. You either need to unplug the drill press if it's cord and plug connected and make sure that the plug remains in the exclusive control of the employee, i.e. they have it in their hand, they have it in their pocket, they're standing on it so nobody can plug it back in while they're working on it, whatever the case may be. And if it's hardwired, they need to turn off the drill press, make sure that the hazardous energy is controlled, and you need to ensure that the energy is under the exclusive control of the employee doing the work. How you do that, up to you. You have to make sure that it's safe for the employee in that process. So again, it's really tough on the normal production operations. OSHA says we know when it is, we know when it isn't. It's up to the employer to prove one way or the other on the circumstances. And this is one of the areas that some employers try to contest OSHA citations, that it's normal production. The issue is if you have an employee injured as part of the process, you've pretty much made the case for OSHA saying, well, yeah, we think it's normal production operations, but OSHA is going to say clearly it's hazardous and you're not using appropriate controls, whether it's lockout, tagout, machine guarding, or something else. And realize that most OSHA citations are the result of complaints or amputations. And OSHA is seeing more and more lockout, tagout violations because they're getting lots of the amputation reports that are required to be submitted to. And so go in and they look, oh, lockout, tagout violation or machine guarding violation, and they both are quite expensive. I forgot to mention, in 2018, fiscal year 2018 for OSHA, they had somewhere around the neighborhood of, I think it was 3,000 OSHA citations for lockout, tagout. The average citation was $5,600 per citation. What's interesting is that there's about 1.8 citations, lockout citations, given for every inspection. So it is number one for general industry for OSHA citations. Cord and plug connected equipment, as I said, is exempt from lockout, tagout as long as the plug is under the exclusive control doing the work, and it's the only energy source. So the unplugging of that piece of equipment must de-energize and control all the energy sources for that equipment. My favorite example, overhead garage door. Everybody thinks overhead garage doors are exempt from lockout, tagout procedures, but they're not. You have the torsion spring that has kinetic energy, I think. You have the door itself that can fall down, and then you have the motor and the garage door opener. So you really have three energy sources. About a decade ago, it used to be about 14 people a year died messing with torsion springs on garage doors. I don't have any idea what the current number is, but I wouldn't think it's changed substantially. So you need to make sure you're paying attention here. If it truly is a drill press, you can unplug the drill press. The employee has control of it. The chuck doesn't fall out. The chuck stays up. There's no other energy sources. Then we're good to go with the cord and plug connected exemption. So we're getting into OSHA says you have to have a energy control program. I love this part because this is one of the few standards that OSHA says this doesn't have to be, they don't specifically state it, but OSHA doesn't say it has to be a written energy control program. But if you read the standard, there's certain documentation that's required. You have to have written energy control procedures, which we'll talk about. You have to have the written periodic inspection, which we'll talk about. You have to have the training records, of course. And you need to have, if you utilize it, an emergency removal procedure of the lockout devices. So therefore, most employers write a written lockout program. And I think that actually leads to some of the confusion. They think, oh, I have a written lockout program, so therefore I don't have to utilize, or I don't have to write machine-specific energy control procedures. And OSHA says, no, you need to be writing machine-specific energy control procedures. I apologize if you can hear that being in the background. You need to write machine-specific energy control procedures, and that's just part of your lockout process. Get briefly into the employee training requirements. There's 3 types of employees when it comes to lockout, and if you're utilizing lockout in your organization, which vast majority of organizations do unless they really don't do any equipment maintenance, no maintenance of, maybe you're in an office setting and the only thing you have is a furnace that's on the roof and your employees wouldn't be exposed to it. But most industrial settings, nursing homes, hospitals, you're going to have to train employees on one of the 3 levels of lockout. You have the authorized employees. Those are the ones who do lockout. You have the affected employees. Those are the ones that may be impacted by lockout, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then you have other employees. Those are employees that work in areas where lockout may be used. So maybe that's a clerk that's walking through a department. They don't use a piece of equipment that's ever locked out, but they could see a piece of equipment that's locked and tagged out. So authorized employees, they get the most training. And I think in a lot of cases, the training that most employers are providing is marginally meets OSHA's expectation. OSHA says you need to train employees on the type and magnitude of the energy available in the workplace. So do you talk about the different electrical voltages that you have in your facility? You have 120, 220, 208. Do you have other higher voltages? And then are people authorized to work on all of those electrical voltages? Do they have high pressure air systems? Do you have steam systems, hydraulics, other types of energy sources? All these things need to be considered. Do employees understand them to the extent necessary that they can safely do lockout? They have to understand training on the hazards of the energy to be controlled. Do they understand what happens if they have a high pressure release of air and the hazards that might cause, especially if that got into their skin? Same thing with hydraulic oil. If you have hydraulic systems and that releases or leaks, do they understand the hazards of that? They need to understand the methods and means necessary for energy control and isolation. Do they know how to shut the valves, isolate the system, apply blanks if they're needed, apply locks, ensure that those things work? Do they know how to ensure that the process worked? And that, to me, is one of the biggest weaknesses in lockout is employees go apply locks and tags, they turn off energy sources, they apply locks to lock them out, and then they never verify that it worked, or they never relieve the stored pressure, and then they're seriously injured or killed because of that. And I would say the training a lot of times never is hands-on. It's classroom. We never go show employees how to throw circuit breakers. We never show them how to properly close valves. We never teach them how to isolate. We never teach them how to verify that the energy sources are de-energized and controlled. And OSHA says that authorized employees need to be trained on the emergency removal procedures if used, which again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Authorized employees also need to have the knowledge and skill required for the safe application. This goes back to my previous slide where I talked about, are they really capable of doing it? Do you have proof that they can go out and actually do it, or you've just given them classroom training? My daughter is turning 14 and she's going to be getting her learner's permit here soon to drive a car. And, it's about, sure, we can give her all the classroom training we want, but until she actually experiences driving an automobile in the real world and dealing with others, I don't know that she necessarily has the skill to safely drive a vehicle. The same is true with lockout tagout. It's more than just classroom training. So they need to have the training on the safe application, how to use it, and also how to remove the energy controls. Affected employees are, again, a lower step below. They're not the ones doing lockout tagout, but they're required to use machines or equipment where servicing is performed under lockout tagout. So this might be an equipment operator in a factory where they utilize this piece of equipment. They're not the ones that service or maintain it, but somebody's going to come and lock that out when it does need to be serviced or maintained. Or they're in a facility, their equipment's under lockout tagout, and they're going to be working around the equipment. They're going to be working in the area of the equipment. Maybe they're sweeping up or cleaning the production area while equipment's locked out. And OSHA says they're affected employees and they need to be trained. They need to be instructed on the purpose and the use of the energy control procedure. They need to understand the limitations, what that procedure does. They need to be trained that they shouldn't violate the locks and tags, try to restart the equipment, etc. And then lastly, we have all other employees. Again, these are the employees that may be in the area where lockout is used. So that clerk walks through the production department and sees that the equipment's locked out. They just need to be instructed about the procedure, the limitations of what the general lockout procedure is, the lockout program that you have, and about the prohibition related to attempting to restart or re-energize the equipment or machine. That they just need to be aware, an awareness level of, hey, we have this process in place to protect employees. If you ever see these locks, if you ever see these tags, don't bypass them. Don't try to restart that piece of equipment. What's interesting, I've worked in a number of industrial facilities, and we've never trained all three of these classes of employees. Either everybody's been an authorized employee, we had authorized and others, or we trained everybody to authorized and affected level. It's not that it's right or wrong. It's just, as I put this presentation together, I realized that never once have I provided 3 levels of training. We've always lumped the employees differently. That's up to you. That's up to how you run your business and the amount of time you want to spend training employees on this particular issue. OSHA has a retraining requirement to the lockout standard. It's a performance-based lockout standard. It doesn't say you need to do retraining annually. And most employers realize that, and so I rarely see retraining when it comes to lockout. OSHA says retraining is required whenever there's changes in the job assignment. So the employee maybe is working on a new energy source they've never had experience with before. If there's a new machine or piece of equipment that's got a whole different lockout process than maybe some others, or where there's a process that just presents a new hazard that employees may have never experienced before, or there's changes in energy control procedures. Maybe you realize there's a deficiency in all of your machine-specific energy control procedures. OSHA says, hey, you need to go ahead and retrain everybody. You don't need to train them on the entire program. You just need to train them on the changes that create this new hazard for the employees. OSHA also says that retraining is required whenever your annual inspection or your periodic inspection reveals, or as an employer, if you observe somebody or have a reason to believe that there's deviations from or inadequacies in the employee's knowledge or use of the energy control procedures, you need to do retraining. This, again, is one where OSHA has a tendency to issue violations because an employee is utilizing lockout. They don't do something properly. They lose a finger. OSHA comes in, does an inspection. They give you a citation for not having machine-specific procedures, maybe, not following the procedures. And then they give you a citation because you didn't retrain the employees when you clearly knew there was a deficiency in the process because you just injured an employee. Thus, this is how we get more than one lockout citation per lockout inspection. So, gotcha. And I'm not saying it's bad. I understand OSHA's role. I understand how they go about it. And when they find deficiencies, they have an obligation to give you a citation for them. It's just interesting how these can build and build and build, that you have one minor deficiency and really you start to look at it closely and you have a number of deficiencies related to that. OSHA says that as the employer, you also need to make sure you're keeping an employee training log. You need to certify that the employee was trained, certify that the employee was trained to an authorized, affected, or other employee level. You need to have the employee's name and the date of the training. I always encourage you to keep the name of the trainer that did the training and keep a copy of any training materials that may have been provided. Provides a real nice packet of, if you ever get inspected, you can go to OSHA and say, look, here's the employees that were trained, here's the date they were trained, here's the video we took of the training session, here's the handouts from the training session, here's the slides we used, whatever reference material you want to keep. But then OSHA can see, hey, you did it, and you did it to some level. And that can often help you if OSHA comes in and accuses you of not doing training or not doing adequate training. So now we're getting into the meat and potatoes of the standard. we're getting into the machine-specific energy control procedures. I want to start out by saying, except in certain circumstances, which we'll talk about, and you have to meet all 8 criteria, you have to have machine-specific energy control procedures. OSHA says if right here in these, if you meet all 8 of these conditions, then you do not need machine-specific procedures for that particular piece of equipment or that particular process. So here's when you're exempt from having to write machine-specific procedures at the machine level. If the machine has no potential for stored or residual energy or reaccumulation of stored energy. Number 2 is where there's a single energy source that can be readily identified and isolated. 3 is isolation and locking of that single energy source will completely de-energize and deactivate the machine or equipment. Number 4, the machine or equipment is isolated from the energy source and locked out during servicing or maintenance. Number 5, a single lockout device will achieve a locked out condition. Number 6, the lockout device is under the exclusive control of the employee performing the servicing or maintenance work. Number 7, servicing or maintenance does not create hazards for other employees. And number 8, the employer, in utilizing this exception, has had no accidents involving the unexpected activation or re-energization of the machine or equipment during servicing or maintenance. So if you ever have an injury on that particular equipment because you're using this exemption, you need to then implement a procedure. I want to go back 2 slides. It's kind of an important part. It says a single lockout device will achieve a locked out condition. Somebody may say, hey, we have this conveyor. It's powered by an electric motor. We throw a disconnect. We can apply a lock to that disconnect. We don't need a machine-specific procedure for that conveyor because we've isolated the hazard by throwing the disconnect and putting a lock on it. Therefore, I've controlled it. I've met all the requirements. Keep in mind that let's say there's a hopper dropping cookie dough onto this conveyor. You've locked out the hopper, you've locked out the conveyor, single energy source, but you're like, oh, we need to stop that cookie dough from falling onto that conveyor because otherwise the employee is going to get engulfed in cookie dough or whatever it might be. Then that process isn't exempt because we need to lock out that hopper of that cookie dough. So because we have to lock out 2 energy sources, 2 potential hazards, the drive motor on the conveyor and the hopper that's dropping the product, OSHA says, look, this exemption doesn't apply because we need to lock out 2 things. And remember, it's single energy source in number 2. And so right away, we have to start being careful about, we have to look at upstream and downstream processes related to the piece of equipment we're locking out because there's concerns there as to what other hazards may exist and how you go about controlling them. Daniel sent a question about what's the best way to de-energize a starting capacitor, and I would say talk to an electrician because there's lots of ways you can ground it. We don't want to cause damage to the electrical components. We don't want to cause potential harm to the employee. And in some circumstances, unless we're pulling the capacitor out, we might be able to do other things to prevent potential harm to the employee doing the task. And that's the inherent problem with lockout, is that we often get focused on locking out a machine, and I would say there's times where I might have multiple procedures for one piece of equipment depending on the purpose or what the intent of the employee's activities are. If I'm replacing a drive motor on a piece of equipment, I need to make sure I'm killing the power to that drive and any control power. It doesn't mean I necessarily have to worry about much else. And I sometimes see packaging equipment, or let's say a water bottling line where we're making the bottle, we're filling the bottle with water, we're capping it, and they take 40 locks, they de-energize all the source of equipment. But at the same time, I'm looking, look, to do this specific task, I really only need 2 or 3 locks because I don't have to lock out the stuff way upstream and the stuff downstream. I need to focus right here. And so some employers only want to write one procedure to cover a machine, and then it takes a lot of time to apply all the locks and tags, and then we find employees don't follow that. Or we write a whole bunch of specific procedures for each thing we might do on that piece of equipment if it's more routine. I don't want to say normal production operation, but it's something where we see we have to go routinely into the machine to perform the servicing or maintenance. However, then that creates some other problems, which we'll talk about. So each machine that's not exempt must have a machine-specific written energy control procedure. If you think about this, all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, we have 400, 500 pieces of equipment in our facility and we only have 2 procedures. that most likely is a problem. OSHA says that in a letter of interpretation, not in the standard itself, it says that similar machines or equipment can use the same procedure. And I'm going to say absolutely they can, however, it's a fine balance. OSHA specifically states that it has to be a similar machine or equipment that has the same type or magnitude of energy, and it has the same or similar controls. Great, that's wonderful. Maybe you have a lot of a certain press in your facility, and so you utilize that press all the time, and they're very similar in models. And it's okay to have one procedure as long as it's similar enough, and that similar enough gets to be a problem. Give me 1 second here. Fighting a technical issue. OSHA then goes on to say, not only have to have the same type of magnitude of energy and same and similar controls, you must have the same steps for shutting down, isolating, blocking, and securing or controlling the hazardous energy. The steps for the placement, removal, transfer of the lockout and tagout devices must be the same and specific, the same. And you must also have the same specific requirements for the testing to verify the effectiveness or lockout, tagout devices and other energy control measures. Now, here's the problem I run into. Worked in a large industrial facility. We had something like 1,200 lockout procedures, and many of our procedures covered 20, 30, 40 pieces of the same equipment. We found at one time we had the same machine, or we thought we had the same machine. However, once we got into looking at the energy control procedure and how each machine was plumbed, is they had made some significant changes from generation 1 to generation 2 of that piece of equipment. So therefore, we had to have two different procedures. One procedure for the first 20 machines that were generation 1, and another procedure that covered the second generation equipment that we had 30 of. And then we found out we had another problem. We found out that how we plumbed the steam and the water and the air into the machines and where we put the disconnects was even different within those machines as well. So ultimately, over the 30 pieces of equipment, I think we had 8 different procedures. The 8 different procedures, and each procedure then we specified this applies to machines 1, 3, and 5. This one applies to machines 2, 4, 6 through 10, and this procedure applies through machines 11 through 12, because we felt that they weren't similar enough that an employee could follow the procedure to safely lock out that piece of equipment for themselves. This particular facility also had a history of lockout violations, and we had some other things going on with OSHA all the time regarding lockout, but it just shows you that we understood that there was a difference in the same machine, that it truly wasn't the same, and so we had to have different procedures. OSHA then says if you're using one procedure that covers same or similar equipment, which again, I don't want you to overuse this, the procedures must be written in sufficient detail and provide enough direction so that the employee can follow the procedure and determine how to safely perform servicing or maintenance work. And the procedure must identify what equipment it applies to. Again, type and location, OSHA says, or type and model number. And we had machine numbers, so we identified it. Like I said, this works on machines 1, 3, and 5, 2, 4, 6, 7 through 10. And so I don't see this a lot utilized. I see it a lot utilized, but I also see it misused a lot, where they say, oh, we have all these machines and they all do metalworking. Well, some are drill presses, some are brakes, some are punch presses, some are shears. And it's like, no. You can't use that broad of a procedure. We need to say, we have a set of shears and they all happen to be the same style, the same make, the same model, and we plumb them all the same for their energy sources. And that's a perfect example. But if I have a 10-ton press and I have a 1,000-ton press and I have a 500-ton press, and the energy sources are different and the disconnects are different and the valves are different in different locations, I would say you shouldn't be using the same procedure for all those machines. So OSHA says you're now going to write all these energy control procedures, and you need to see, OSHA says we need to see certain things in those procedures. And here's one of the things I see is that the first requirement OSHA has is it says a statement of the intended use of the procedure. Usually the statement is something like to keep employees safe by de-energizing equipment. And I'm saying, no, it really needs to be more specific than that. If you're writing really specific procedures, maybe we're only writing a procedure to change the hydraulic filter on a press or a pump. And then we're going to say, this purpose of this procedure is to enable the safe change out of the hydraulic filter. And then I just need to make sure the electricity of the pumps are turned off, and I need to make sure the valves on both sides of the filter are shut off. I don't have to go through everything else that's related to that piece of equipment, unless, of course, employees are exposed to that hazard. So it's a benefit to really look at the things employees are doing routinely and figure out, can we make a more condensed procedure that keeps them safe to do that particular task? While it makes it more efficient to do that, again, when we get to that periodic inspection, you'll see that it does cause some problems. So that energy control procedure also has to have the specific procedural steps for shutting down, isolating, blocking, securing, and controlling the hazardous energy. Should also talk about verification. Why that's not there, I'm not sure. And the requirements procedures also talk about the specific procedural steps for the placement, removal, and transfer of the locking devices and the responsibility for them. Sorry about my typo in my slides there. Also, those energy control procedures, as I talked about, I mentioned, my bullets are just slightly out of order. There needs to be specific requirements for the testing of the machine or equipment to determine and verify the effectiveness of the lockout measures, the lockout devices, and other energy control measures. Again, I think this is the part that's often overlooked by employees. They simply go in, they throw that disconnect. They don't realize that that electrical disconnect has been arced across and that it's still providing power to the circuits, even though the handle is now in the off position. They don't verify, to Daniel's point, as Chad earlier, that, oh, wow, we have this large starter capacitor in this motor control center of this motor, and we didn't do anything to isolate that capacitor from what we're working on. We did nothing to drain that capacitor down to make it safe. And so that's really where it's key to have somebody with a lot of knowledge develop these procedures. We have to have somebody that understands the inherent hazards, the magnitude, the type of the hazards, as that training talks about, to make sure it truly is safe. And then we need to teach people how to test these things to make sure it's achieved a safe position or a safe status. I, by no means, am pushing Brady's products here, but Brady, the label company, BradyID.com, they have a software product, various software products. I think they have at least 2 at various price points that enable you to create lockout procedures. Now, here's the first page of a lockout procedure, because notice it doesn't have a purpose on it, doesn't have some other things that are required to be on it, but it's a visual lockout procedure. And I really like the visual procedures. We show the disconnects, we show where the valves are, we talk about the energy sources, the locations, how they're controlled, what the device is that you use to apply. Do I apply a lock? Do I apply a lock and a hasp? Whatever's appropriate. Do I use chains? Do I use a ball valve, handle cover, etc.? And so, really nice example. You don't have to buy their software. You can create something similar using Word and Excel. There's companies out there that they will come in and they will write your lockout procedures for you. They will do annual inspections of your lockout program, which I'd love to see how they do that, but that's a whole different issue. And so Brady just has a really great example here of a product of a visual lockout procedure that I really like. I think it makes it nice and easy. It's better than just having a bunch of words and explaining, go turn off the third disconnect on the south bank of the motor control center. And people are going, well, I don't know what north, south, east, or west is. Are we counting the third disconnect in the major bank or a third disconnect in a smaller bank? And so pictures, really nice, especially everybody carries a cell phone today that takes cameras. Everybody has digital cameras that they can download pictures into software to create these nice visual documents. So we talked about training, we've talked about energy control procedures. When they're required, you need to have machine-specific procedures unless you have very similar pieces of equipment that you can lump together. And here's what OSHA says the lockout process needs to be. OSHA says, look, we want you to follow this process. No ifs, ands, or buts. This is the process you always follow and needs to be part of your machine-specific procedures. Prepare for shutdown. Eliminate people, equipment, materials from the area that aren't necessary to safely perform the work. You shut down the equipment. Traditionally, we hope this is via the normal process, turn it off, whatever the process may be, but you shut down that equipment like you would at the end of a day or end of a shift. You then isolate the energy sources. You lock out those individual energy sources. You make sure you adequately control any stored or residual energy so it cannot cause harm. And then you go and verify isolation and de-energization. So this is the generic process your machine-specific procedures then talk about. where the isolation is, how you isolate, how you lock out, how you control the stored energy. So this is the generic process. Your procedures also have to talk about the release from lockout. Specifically, you're going to remove any non-essential items and people from the area, clear employees from the work area as well, remove your lockout devices, and then reinitiate that machine as you need to or you normally would to put it back into production or operation. Now, OSHA says you need to be aware of some special circumstances, contractors being number one. If you have contractors come into your facility, whether they're HVAC people or maybe you bring them in to do a massive overhaul of a production line, you need to have an understanding what that contractor's lockout program is, and you need to train your employees, not the contractor's employees, but your employees on the contractor's program so your employees are also aware. Because not everybody's going to use the same color of equipment. Not everybody's going to use the same tags. And so your employees need to be aware of what the contractor uses. And if your employees are doing lockout, I would say the contractor also needs to be trained in your process so that nobody is potentially bypassing inadvertently somebody else's lockout process. Group lockout is an issue. Group lockout is where you have a bunch of tradespeople. Imagine a steel plant, you have 200, 300 tradespeople come in, or a petrochemical firm, and they're all working on a piece of equipment. Well, you really can't apply 250 locks to a circuit breaker or a electrical disconnect. So you need to come up with a lockout, a group lockout process. Now, if it's a small group, you can use the hasp like shown at the bottom down there, where you can have up to 6 employees apply their locks to that hasp, and then each employee has to remove their lock, and then the hasp can be open. Or you can have and establish a procedure for group lockout where you have one designated employer, maybe one employee from each trade, electrical, plumbing, pneumatic, however your facility might be broken out. They go through, they follow the lockout process, turn off the equipment, isolate the energy sources. One person applies their lock and tag. They validate that the energy is controlled. They then put their keys in a lockbox, and then everybody in that project is putting their lock on that lockbox. So until everybody's lock is removed from that lockbox, nobody can go in and energize that piece of equipment. You have to have that established procedure, though, because how do the employees that are coming on later get to validate that the energy source is secure? There's some issues and hang-ups there that you need to make sure you address, and so there's various ways you can do that. The other one is shift or personnel changes. You have a project that goes on for more than a shift, or you have multiple people that are going to be involved because there's various trades or various people are needed to do that. Well, you need to make sure you have a good process for ensuring everybody's safety through shift or personnel changes. OSHA doesn't, it's a performance-based standard. It's how you choose to do it. You just need to make sure you're protecting the employees in a consistent manner, and employees are aware of what that process is. Emergency removal. I find it funny. OSHA says you don't need to train on this unless you ever do it. I've never worked in a facility where we didn't have to do emergency removal of a lockout device. Employee was working on a project, got called away for some emergency and was sick, or the project was locked out for months and the employee happened to be on vacation when we finally finished the project. So you need to have a documented process with employee training. You need to verify that the employee who applied the lockout device is not in the facility. It's up to you to determine how you do that. You need to make all reasonable efforts to contact the authorized employee that their lockout device has been removed. Again, up to you to determine how you do that. And you need to ensure each authorized employee has knowledge before resuming work. Again, up to you. What was nice in our facility is we had badges, so you couldn't get into the building unless your badge gave you access. So we turned off an employee's badge if we had to remove their lockout device, so they'd have to go to security. Security would see a notice on the electronic badge system saying, look, this employee had a piece of their lock and tag cut off a piece of equipment, and they need to have their supervisor talk to them. So we'd have the supervisor come up, meet them at security, explain what happened. It's nothing against the employee, but we're really trying to keep them safe. We didn't want that employee going back to work thinking they need to finish up working on that piece of equipment and it's running and they don't recognize it or it's already been re-energized. So we had a very strict process about how we did that. And so we had this lockout tagout removal form. This is quite old because you wouldn't see the word tagout on it anymore since I wrote it. But we talked about the date, the department, the machine or equipment involved, how we attempted to locate the employee, the calls we made, we'd log them. We describe what we did to remove the lock, who was present, and how we discussed with the employee of the incident upon their return to work. So we had a very dedicated, detailed process how we did that. Another special circumstance OSHA likes to bring up is testing or repositioning that requires a temporary removal of isolating devices. You can't always lock something out and keep it locked out and perform all the maintenance and servicing that's required. Best example is, not the best, an example is alignment of a conveyor belt. You need that conveyor belt to run to make sure it's truly tracking properly. So OSHA says, look, when you have to test or position equipment as part of servicing or maintenance, there needs to be a procedure. Here's what their procedure is. Clear machines or tools or materials from the work area, remove employees from the work area, remove the lockout devices, energize the equipment, test it, position it as appropriate, do whatever is necessary. Same could be true for setting a die in a punch press. De-energize and reapply the energy control measures following the lockout process and make any final adjustments before you put that piece of equipment back into operation. So again, it's just a thoughtful process to make sure we're not potentially putting anybody at harm when they're testing or positioning equipment as part of the repair and maintenance process to make sure they're not injured or others aren't injured in that as well. Specifically, OSHA says, look, when you go provide employees, and you need to provide employees with the lockout equipment, you need to make sure that you're providing with the locks, tags, chains, wedges, etc. Whatever's needed in your facility to safely lock out the equipment, you need to provide that. You also need to make sure that those devices are singularly identified and shall be, 1, the only devices used for controlling the energy, 2, not used for other purposes, and 3, durable, meaning they can withstand the environment in which they're exposed. They're standardized, consistent in either color, shape, or size. It seems everybody goes for red as a color makes it easy to standardize. They need to be substantial, meaning that they cannot be removed without the use of excessive force, i.e. a heavy-duty bolt cutters. Can't just use a snips and cut that lock off. And it needs to be identifiable. It needs to be able to include the name of the employee applying the device. I've only seen OSHA give citations in this in one circumstance, and it's where an employer provided locks to employees, lockout locks. They're all red, said, this lock has been applied by the employee's name was embossed in the lock, and the employee decided to use the locks on their locker to lock up their tools in their locker. OSHA said that's fine, but you're going to pay $3,000 for the employee's privilege of doing that. Lockout locks, lockout equipment, hasps, all those things need to only be used for lockout. And you need to have a strict policy in place that they are not used for anything other than lockout and energy control. Again, this is the one area I don't see too many citations from OSHA on. Now we get to the part that I see neglected absolutely the most when an organization has a functioning lockout program. And that is the periodic inspection or annual review requirement. OSHA calls it periodic inspection, but specifically they go and state that all energy control procedures need to be inspected annually to ensure the procedure works and employees are following the requirements of the standard. So real key things here. 1, all energy control procedures, and we're talking about the machine-specific procedures, need to be inspected annually. It's not like only once in a while. It's not just a few procedures. It's all procedures annually. This is a massive, 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 massive burden. If you have procedures you don't use in a year, OSHA kind of says that you don't have to lock out the equipment for the sake of evaluating the procedure, but you still should ensure that the procedure is correct. Before I've been working on this presentation, I went to find that particular letter of interpretation, and I cannot locate it anywhere, but I know it's out there. An authorized employee, other than the one utilizing the procedure, needs to do the inspection. So if you're a small nursing home and you only have one maintenance employee, you need to figure out a way that the maintenance employee is not doing their own inspection because they can't do it. They're not permitted. OSHA says you need to have 2 people. One to do the authorized employee to do the inspection, and 1 employee to do or be implementing the procedure, because we need to do these evaluations as the procedures are implemented. For some of you, you really have to do an evaluation of every lockout as it's being done because you don't do enough lockouts in a year to cover maybe 5-10% of your procedures. So this is a major issue. I worked at one employer, again, where we had 12 to 1,500 lockout procedures, and we had an employee hired 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week to do nothing but periodic inspections, and he would follow the tradespeople around and keep a log of every procedure he saw utilized. He'd make sure that obscure ones he got put into the work order system, that if they ever went to work on a particular machine, that they contacted him because he had to be there because we didn't work on that particular machine enough. Very convoluted process, but it really is OSHA's intent to make sure these procedures are working. If memory serves me, it was General Motors filed a lawsuit on this particular issue, or was cited by OSHA, and they appealed it, that they had something like 30,000 procedures throughout all their facilities, and OSHA says, we really don't care. The standard is written the way the standard is, and all the judges kind of agreed with OSHA, saying, yeah, you need to do an annual inspection of your procedures to make sure that A, the procedure is correct, and B, that the employees are following the procedure properly. It's two parts. It's not just one. It's not about just the procedures, but it's also about how the employees utilize that procedure. The inspection process consists of the inspector reviewing with each authorized employee that employee's responsibilities under the energy control procedure. They need to watch the employee utilize the energy control procedure. They need to make sure that if there's any deficiencies, that the employees are talked about, discussed, retrained as appropriate, that the deficiencies are correct or the procedures changed to make sure it's correct. Then the employer needs to certify that the periodic inspection was performed, and the certification needs to identify the machine or equipment on which the energy control procedure is utilized. So we picked the procedure for machines 1, 3, and 5 on March 25th, 2020. Fred and John were the people utilizing the procedure, and Jeremy was the person that was doing the inspection. And so we used to have a lockout control of hazardous energy machine specific procedure review form that we documented who the supervisor was, what the equipment was, the names of the authorized employees on the job. We required that the procedures be posted at the machine. That is not, and was not an OSHA requirement. We reviewed the procedure with the maintenance and production personnel before the drill, before the review. We made sure that the affected employees and the supervision were notified of the lockout work. We also, in addition to notifying the affected employees, we had to notify the supervisor in the area to let them know we were taking equipment out of service. Made sure that they verified the machine or isolation took place. Made sure that the stored energy was released and secured or secured. Made sure that the isolation devices were applied in accordance with our policies. Made sure the appropriate locks and tags were utilized by each individual. So if we have 4 employees and 4 energy sources, we better see a total of 16 locks applied throughout that piece of equipment, or maybe they used a group process, whatever was appropriate. We made sure they followed all the steps to restart the procedure. And if there was any deficiencies, we had to do training with that group at that point in time. And then if we felt that there were major deficiencies throughout doing these inspections every year, then we would go and create a training program based upon those deficiencies. And so our retraining was specifically based upon the deficiencies we saw in lockout. And you'd say, wow, employees aren't that bad. And no, they're not. It's not that they're intentionally doing things wrong. It's just maintenance employees have a tend to want to fix things, and necessarily following a lockout procedure is not high on their priority, even though their life is in jeopardy if they don't properly do it. So it's that fine balancing act between wanting to get the job done and wanting to get the job done safely. So the key requirements, just at a real high level, not the individual ones, but the key requirements, the ones that cause the most headaches from an OSHA perspective, the most injuries from my perspective, from a comp perspective. It's 1, developing those machine-specific energy control procedures, making sure the procedures are in place, making sure they're appropriate and they truly isolate the equipment and allow the work to perform safely, making sure you're doing the appropriate training. They really have the skills needed to apply the energy control devices and do it properly. To Daniel's point, if they need to know how to de-energize a starting capacitor, well, then that should be a skill that they're trained on. And you need to make sure that you're conducting an annual review of the energy control procedures. OSHA says that if you lump energy control procedures, like if you have one procedure that covers 60 machines, because they're similar enough, that you only have to do 1 audit. You don't have to do an audit of every machine, but you do have to audit every procedure. I will admit, I've never seen OSHA give a citation for failure to do a periodic inspection of energy control procedures when there's been no other lockout violations present. However, if you have an employee that utilizes lockout and they utilize it following procedures established and they're injured, OSHA is going to be asking you for a copy of when's the last time this procedure was reviewed. because they want to see, A, have you ever reviewed them, and B, how did you get a change that changed that piece of equipment so much that the employee wasn't retrained, because again, change in process equipment, lockout, they need to be retrained, or is it just deficiency somewhere else in the process? I'm not saying you should ignore, I would never say you should ignore doing the annual review of energy control procedures. However, again, the only time I see OSHA issuing citations on that is where there's been other lockout violations that led them to say, okay, show us that you've been doing reviews the way you should be doing them. So we've reached the end of this presentation, 9 minutes early, which is a record for me, if any of you know me. If you have any questions, you can chat them in the chat box and I will respond to them. You can feel free to send me an email, or you can give me a call. Just wait about 20 minutes before you call me, though. Hope you learned something from this webinar. The handouts are available below the chat box there. You can download those in PDF format. I hope you've learned something, but please reach out to me if you have any questions. Be more than happy to help you in any way that we can to create a safer workplace. So now I will shut up and we will let people chat any questions that they may have. I've been quiet now for a minute because there's a little timer I can watch. I appreciate your attention to this. Hopefully you got something out of this, and hopefully we all get through this coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic without having any significant issues to you, your family, to your organizations, because this will be a trying time for everybody. Thank you everyone for your time. Take care.